So hopefully from the last video, I was able to show you guys how good a mono ingredient build can be for your Pokemon, for your ingredient specialists. And I was able to show you guys the changes that has happened since the 3 new Paldean Pokemon had been released. If you haven't seen this video yet, I highly recommend you watch that before you watch this video. Because in this video, I'm actually going to address some of the questions, comments, and concerns you guys had from the last video. Now, many of these concerns or questions, they're not new. We've had these questions since the start of the game. I do try to answer them. It's just that sometimes there's not enough time in a video to repeat the same concepts over again. So that is why this video hopefully helps clarify those problems. And in this video, I'm going to try and work a new semi-mono ingredient spread where we try to use more honorary alternatives like Cacao Blastoise instead of having to hunt a mono Absol, which is a bit different to the mono ingredient spread. We'll come to that at the end of the video. But first, let's address those questions and some basic concepts. First of all, why is Quaquaval a leek mono ingredient when it clearly does beans at base? Well, that's only because there's no other Pokemon that can do leek at base level, so it's just a lot simpler for me to say that ingredients like leek, mushroom, tails, they are part of this mono ingredient build if they are as mono as they can be. Obviously, Ditto can only farm tails at level 60, so it's very far away from being a true mono, but the alternative is to run a non-ingredient specialist, so then Ditto takes the spot for an ingredient specialist, as you can see up here, that does mono tails. But then in neither case is it truly mono. We just have to accept this until a true mono comes along, then these options will be removed from the list. Second question, why did I say that getting mono ingredient is a 1 in 9 chance when clearly there's 2 ingredient choices at level 30 and 3 ingredient choices at level 60, so it should be a 1 in 6 chance to get apple, apple, apple on a Skeledirge, for example. Well, the reason, and this has been known for a long time, is that the chance of getting the same ingredient at the level 30 slot is 1 in 3, not 1 in 2. So it's more likely that you would encounter a Fuecoco with sausage in the level 30 slot, as opposed to apple. There's a 2 in 3 chance that you'll see sausage instead of apple. So because there's a 1 in 3 chance for apple in the level 30 slot, and 1 in 3 chance for apple to be on the level 60 slot, in total to get this list is actually 1 in 9. If you're curious to know where this stat came from, you can go under documentations under game mechanics, ingredient combination appearance rates. You click on that, it will show you how these numbers came about. So you can see that the chance of landing mono apple is an 11% chance, or 1 in 9. And anytime the level 30 ingredient matches the level 1 ingredient, it's 1 in 9. But for the level 30 slot to be the other ingredient, it's 2 in 9 chance. Now the nomenclature here is very important to understand because I'll be referring to this often in later parts of this video and in other videos as well, in case you don't understand what all of these A, B, and C's stand for. This is just a simplified way of saying the same ingredients in all 3 slots, where A may mean apple for Skeledirge or honey for Bulbasaur. So then this is the mono ingredient build. Of course, if it's something like mushroom that doesn't appear in that first slot in any Pokemon, like Gengar for example, which is herb mushroom mushroom, then that would be under the ABB combination, which is a 2 in 9 chance. You can also see what happens when the Pokemon only has 2 ingredients to choose from. Unfortunately, it doesn't improve your chance of getting the mono option. For example, for Toxicroak, even at the level 60 slot, it only has 2 choices. But regardless, the chance of getting oil is still only 1 in 3 chance at each of the ingredient slot. And the chance of getting oil sausage, well, that's a 2 in 3 chance and a 2 in 3 chance for each of the slot, so it's a 4 in 9 chance, which is 44%. So the logic works the same way at level 60 if there's only 2 ingredients to choose from, that the third ingredient only has a 1 in 3 chance to land. Now then you might say, bro Vinny, this is really difficult to do if we're hunting for mono ingredient, because 1 in every 9 of the Fuecoco that you catch will have apple, apple, apple. Whereas mixed ingredient is a lot easier because everything else is mixed. Well, the problem is the mixed ingredient argument doesn't actually specify which ingredient list that we're talking about, because a full mixed ingredient list is very different to one that is closer to a mono ingredient build. In any case, one that is closest to the mono ingredient is often preferred, so that you don't have to hunt the mono, not because the mono isn't good. So it becomes really wishy-washy when someone says that mixed ingredient is good. Well, which option are we talking about? Are we talking about apple, sausage, apple? That's just Fuecoco trying to be an apple farmer. Or is it apple, sausage, sausage? Well, that's just a Charizard in disguise. Or is it apple, sausage, herb? And then you have to find a recipe that matches exactly those ratios, which is almost impossible to do in order to maximize the benefit of this Pokemon. So if we're going to talk about mixed ingredients, we need to specify which mixed ingredient we're talking about. In the early game, before mono ingredient became a prevalent idea, there were people who described these options as being viable, because what these options allow you to do is to have equal amounts of A and B ingredients or A and C ingredients, so that you can farm 2 ingredients in equal amounts and not have to switch out the team members as much. But the problem with this is, well, which of these 2 are we talking about? Because they also have a 1 in 9 chance of occurring, which is just as hard to catch as a mono ingredient. If you're after a Skeledirge that has apple, apple, herb, because you want half of each ingredient, which with current recipe doesn't actually make that much sense because there's nothing that needs half apple and half herbs, but let's assume that there is, well, the hunt for apple, apple, sausage is still 1 in 9. So that means that instead of hunting for one of these options that also have a difficult rate to get, you either just go for the mono or you go for one of these other options, where the second ingredient is a different ingredient to the first, because these options have a 2 in 9 chance to drop, so double the chance of getting than the mono ingredient. In these cases, we're accepting compromises in the amount of ingredient A being farmed. In all of this discussion, I'm assuming that A is actually what you want, and B and C are the unfortunate extra ingredients that you don't actually need, with the exception of leek, tails, and mushrooms, where this is the only possible combination to have. So if given that in any week your preferred dish wants A as the ingredient, for example, you're in dessert week, you need apples from Skeledirge, how do we rank these 6 different combinations? Well, before we even cover that, you should know that there's actually a 7th option. And the 7th option is what I call a BAA option. BAA because it's actually a different species. For example, Skeledirge with apple, apple, apple might be the best at apples, and the second best apple option for Skeledirge at level 60 would be apple, sausage, apple. Because at level 60, it still heavily farms more apple than it does sausage, so it's as close to mono ingredient as you can get. But there is another option instead of going for this kind of mid Fuecoco, and it is to go with a different species that can do those ingredients at the level 30-60 slot, where it doesn't do it in the level 1 slot. Pinsir, for example, is where it can farm apple, apple at the level 30-60 slot. So this is called a BAA, is a new terminology that I've just come up with because the A is still the preferred ingredient. So when we're comparing the preferred ingredient, apple, Pinsir can be considered. Between a Pinsir that is BAA and a Skeledirge that's ABA, Pinsir actually farms more apples. And it makes sense because level 60 farms the most apples, level 30 is the second most apples, and level 1 hardly farms any ingredients when it drops in comparison. So you can see that Pinsir farms 5 plus 8, 13 apples when it farms 2 honey, whereas Skeledirge in an ABA situation would be 2 plus 7, which is 9 apples, and then we'll farm 4 sausages, which is not what our preferred list is. So if you're thinking about using a Fuecoco that's ABA, you really need to look at whether you have a Pinsir that's BAA, because that will be better for apples. But otherwise, you should come back to the mono ingredient list and just go for AAA, because Skeledirge is otherwise the best at apples. And while Pinsir is more expensive to hunt and harder to find, the advantage of a BAA option is that for each Pinsir that you encounter, you have more chances of getting BAA than you are to get Skeledirge with AAA. Remember, it's a 1 in 9 chance to get triple apple, whereas Pinsir has a 2 in 9 chance of getting honey apple apple. So there's a balancing act here where is it actually better to farm Fuecoco or is it better to farm Pinsir? In my personal opinion, I think overall it's still better to just hunt a mono apple Fuecoco because Pinsir is expensive and by the time you do get one, you may not have enough candies to raise it to level 60. But we need to apply this concept to other Pokemon as well, because for a Abomasnow, for example, the situation is reversed. This is Abomasnow's ingredient choices that you can have, but most of the time we talk about Abomasnow for farming eggs because there are too many tomato options. It's better for Abomasnow to cover the difficult ingredient to get, that is eggs. Why is it difficult? Well, that's because the only other Pokemon that can do it is Delibird, and Delibird is expensive, it's rare, and to get a 1 in 9 chance for mono egg is gonna cost you a lot of biscuits. Whereas Snover only needs 5 friendship points to catch, and the chance of the egg being in the level 30 and 60 slot is 2 in 9 as opposed to 1 in 9 for Delibird. There's no doubt that Delibird still is the better of the egg farmers, but it's just more realistic, more practical to have an Abomasnow to cover your eggs as you're hunting for the Delibird. So don't be too confused when I say things are BAA. What I mean by that is just that the A is the preferred ingredient and I'm comparing it to another species. Otherwise, when we're comparing within the same species, we still use the terminology AAA or ABB. But why is this important? It's because now we're going to rank the different combinations of ingredients that you can have. If you can't farm a mono ingredient, what is your second or third best option to have? If it were within the same species, so let's say Skeledirge, we would start with mono apple, which is AAA, but the second best option at level 60 would be ABA, where the third ingredient is farmed a lot more than the second and first slot of ingredients, so this is still heavily focused on apples. But it is not more than a Pinsir that focuses on apples. So we'll start with AAA as the number 1 ingredient choice, but BAA, which is a different species, for example Pinsir, which is the second best ingredient choice. It's as close to mono ingredient as you can get without landing AAA. And then that's when we talk about ABA as the third close to mono ingredient build that you can have. But unfortunately, the downside of this option is it sounds good on paper, but while you're waiting for your Pokemon to go from level 30 to 60 to unlock that third ingredient, you're stuck with farming mostly B, which may not be what you want. So its role will be inverted as you're leveling it up. If you're using a sausage heavy Skeledirge while waiting to unlock that apple when you've already got sausages covered maybe by Charizard, so you're not really getting much apples at all. In which case, what my recommendation is to use an AAX, so X meaning any of these ingredients, at level 30 until you find one that is AAA. You would keep that Pokemon at level 30 because you don't want to over-invest and then having to start again later on, just so you have some apples in the meantime. And this is one of the strategies many people have used. Remember that the level of the Pokemon doesn't actually affect your ingredient strength production that much. Ingredient strength is more heavily influenced by the dish level than the Pokemon level. The same is not to be said about berry strength. Berry strength scales up with the Pokemon level. So if it's a berry specialist, you just level up as quickly as you can, as much as you can to maximize the berry output. For ingredient specialists, just keep them at level 30 so that they farm the ingredients that you need for now until you get a better one or a perfect one. So while ABA on paper sounds better, I would actually suggest you use one of these other options, AAC or AAB, at level 30 until you find a better option that is AAA. But we have to finish the theory, the paperwork, before we actually talk about the practicality. So let's go again with AAA being our number one choice, BAA being our second choice, ABA being the third choice, then AAB and AAC are the fourth choice because they farm equal amounts of ingredient A. Followed by, finally, ABB and ABC, which don't have much A in them, which I assume is your preferred ingredient. Then these two would be the lowest ranking of all. For example, having a Skeledirge that's apple sausage sausage, or apple sausage herb. These would be the lowest tier of ingredient specialists, and pretty much no amount of perfect stats would make me want to invest in that Pokemon. Whereas if I get a mono apple Pokemon and it doesn't quite have perfect stats, but it's got pretty good stats, I would be ready to invest that. Or an ABA option that, even though the list isn't ideal, but it's got perfect stats, then it might be worth the investment. You just have to hit the level 60 as soon as you can. And we'll actually take a look at some examples of, well, how good does an ABA option have to be in order to beat the AAA option? Unless, of course, you've got an alternative option that is BAA, like a different species that heavily focuses on the A option still, which is another topic we'll cover in this video. We'll be looking at how that shifts the entire chart of your mono ingredient build in order to achieve that option for every single ingredient. And of course, once again, if we're talking about leek and mushrooms, then it's only this option that is priority until they make it available at level 1. And you can rework the ranking yourself by using this as the number one choice. But just to avoid overcomplicating things in this video, we're going to ignore leek and mushroom for now. And by the way, the jump from level 30 to 60 in order to avoid farming sausages if you land an ABA option that has perfect stats, just be aware that the same problem doesn't apply when you've got a BAA option. For example, a pincer would still more heavily farm apples at level 30 when you can't make it to the level 60 slot. So if you've got a pincer that's honey apple, that's better than using a Skeledirge that's apple sausage if you're after apples at level 30. So I guess what's weirdly interesting is that the only ingredient list where you do the same thing no matter what level you're at is the mono ingredient list. The role of the Pokemon doesn't flip as you level up. Okay, so a common question I now get asked at this point is, well, how good do the stats need to be if a Pokemon is mono ingredient, or maybe it isn't, but it otherwise has amazing stats? How bad can the stats be for a mono ingredient for it to be acceptable, or how good can a non-mono ingredient be for it to be acceptable? But to give you the long story short, I think anyone who has mono ingredient list or the correct list, I think you only need 2 good stats besides the mono ingredient. The mono ingredient itself is a good stat. So besides that, if you have got 2 good stats like helping bonus, ingredient finding, maybe helping speed, then I think it's worthy to invest. If you don't have mono ingredient, but you do have something that's close to a mono ingredient like ABA or a different species but BAA, then I would accept 3 to 4 good stats on those Pokemon to make that species my main farmer of A ingredient. For the free-to-play players though, I would suggest that given how hard it is to actually hunt Pokemon, generally speaking, I don't just mean ingredient specialists because of limited biscuits, I would accept mono ingredient with just 1 good stat, maybe just helping bonus or maybe just ingredient finding up. because you have to move on at some point to start hunting other stuff. By the time you actually get a perfect one, the game may have changed and what you were hunting for is no longer relevant. Okay, so once again, we're going to use Skeledirge as our example. And our focus here is to try and hunt apple. I've got two examples. One is mono apple, one is full mixed ingredient ABC Skeledirge. Without any stats, at level 60, the mono apple will farm about 100 apples in 24 hours. Whereas the full mixed ingredient will farm only 15% of that, which is not much at all. You will not complete your dessert dishes using an ABC Skeledirge. Sure, it may farm herbs and sausages, and of course they could provide some extra ingredient strength, but once again, when you don't match the recipe, the strength is a lot less. So when you're cooking something like tea time scones, when the dish is at max level, that apple, each apple is worth 4 times its usual value, but you're out here farming herbs, which is worth only 1 time the value, assuming you can even make the recipe to begin with. These ingredients are nearly worthless. They're worth 4 times less. So while the total strength here is about 10,000 in strength, in ingredient strength, and equally so on the mono apple, the mono apple option is valued at 4 times that, whereas on the mixed option, only 15% is worth 4 times the ingredient strength. And that's a stark contrast, hence the value of mono ingredient. But the question is, what if we had amazing stats, like the best stats we can think of? Let's say we give this mixed Skeledirge helping bonus, helping speed, and ingredient finding, and then we give it a nature that's ingredient finding up. Can this even come close to a completely neutral mono apple? And unfortunately, it doesn't even come close. It becomes about 35% in the apple farming of the mono apple option. Yes, everything else has increased as well, so there's no doubt that there's an overall buff to this Skeledirge, but it's not 4 times 100 apples in strength. So I think it's clear that ABC options just don't work. Equally, it won't work if it's an ABB option if apple is what you're after. Of course, at this point, this Skeledirge is actually a sausage farmer. It's not an apple farmer. If this happens to be what you're looking for example, you've decided to fully invest in a ginger Charizard that's ABB as well, then you could potentially have Skeledirge do sausage at level 30 and 60. The catch is that currently there are no other apple farmers that can do mono apple like Skeledirge can. So I think it's a bit silly to have Skeledirge do the role of sausages in that sense. So the next question is, what if we have apple sausage? Do we get enough apples using these amazing stats, helping bonus, helping speed M, ingredient finding M, and ingredient finding up? Can we at least match mono apple? And we can. The good news is, with the absolute best stats in the world, an AAX option, so something that's apple and something else, we can match, in fact beat the apples farmed by a completely neutral mono apple. Of course, at this point, I'm being a bit unfair to mono apple, because what are the chances of all of these stats on a Pokemon? Probably not 1 in 9, which is why I personally feel 1 or 2 good stats on a mono species. So let's say I give it ingredient finding up nature and maybe just helping speed. So I think something like this, now beating the perfect stats but wrong list for Coco, makes a lot of sense. This is how I came up with the suggestion of 1 or 2 good stats, depending on whether you're free to play or not, on a mono species. Of course, if you want perfection, you can look for these stats on a mono species, but I think that's nearly impossible. I've myself probably never had one like that, so it's not something I recommend. In fact, I don't recommend using PR rating for ingredient specialists because it lacks the context. For example, there's no point of having a PR of 100 if your Skeledirge is doing all sausages when you already have a Charizard that does all sausages. It's more important that the ingredient specialist complements what you're missing, what you actually need to hunt, than the PR rating. Of course, if you're comparing 2 Pokemon that has the same ingredient list, then PR rating can be helpful. My personal recommendation and the number I like to look at is the actual ingredient count. So this number here, how many in 24 hours am I expected to get for that ingredient? Of course, it's good to also look at other stats as well, just to put all the context together. For example, the 16 apple difference between these two species, is it worth the extra 100 sausages that it can farm? Well, perhaps it is. Perhaps to you, forgoing 16 apples is worth 100 sausages, even if you think of them as just extra ingredients. So that brings me to the second best ingredient role, assuming A is your preferred ingredient, and that is ABA. And in this scenario, as long as you can skip that level 30 as quickly as possible and go straight to level 60, it can often beat a reasonable mono apple Skeledirge. In fact, in this scenario, it farms 20 more apples than the reasonable mono Skeledirge. The catch though is that this is an average. So with some bad luck, some days you might get more sausages, some days more apples. And once again, the second catch is you have to hit level 60 straight away. Because if you're at level 30, so I've just dropped the level by 1, you can see that you're only farming a third of the apples than mono apple. And this is actually a sausage farmer that flips and becomes an apple farmer again by level 60. And now let's compare to the real second best option for apples, the BAA option, and that is a different species. Pincer is the second best at apples, and if we have BAA that has a higher chance of actually rolling compared to AAA, how far off are the apple farming? So let's have a look. Pincer makes about 15% less apples than Skeledirge if they both have the same stats. A BAA pincer, because it's so close to a mono ingredient, don't forget that level 1 farms the least amount of ingredients. So then, if I just give it one good skill, so let's say ingredient finding M, if it simply just has one good skill, it already farms more ingredients than a mono Skeledirge. So the question we have to ask is it actually worth hunting a pincer, which is more expensive to hunt because it's 16 pips to catch? And do you have enough candies to get it to level 60? Because the same cannot be said when we compare to level 30, because relatively speaking, there's now a 50% chance of dropping honey. So then you can see that even with ingredient finding M, the apples aren't as good as an AA apple Skeledirge. So again, on paper, it sounds great for a BAA pincer. You could just use an AAX Skeledirge until you get an AAA Skeledirge in the future. So these are all alternative options when you don't have perfection. You can go for AAX, ABA, or BAA. They are all possible alternatives. You just have to have much better stats in order to match that of mono ingredient. And out of curiosity, if you're wondering what amount of apples a perfect stat Skeledirge can farm compared to a neutral mono apple can farm, well, we're looking at 2.5 times, 250 apples in 24 hours. And the second best option with perfect stats, so a BAA pincer only does about 200, so about 20% less than a perfect Skeledirge. So while mono ingredient is a goal, it is not a law. You don't have to follow it exactly. It's just a recommendation for you to know what to look for, but you need to consider your own ingredient coverage and what you're willing to accept as compromises for stats. I would like to think of mono ingredient as a good stat in itself. My current favorite way of comparing mono as a stat is to look at ABA as the alternative. The reason is ABA is a 2 in 9 chance to catch and is still heavily focused on farming A. So you will more likely see this ingredient list than this ingredient list. But how good is this ingredient list having that apple as the second slot compared to having sausage? What kind of stats does this Pokemon need in order to match the mono? And it turns out if you have helping bonus and ingredient finding up on the ABA option, then it can match the farming on the mono apple. As you can see, they farm about the same amount of apples in a day. So while this is a relative comparison, because if you change the ingredient list, this doesn't work. They don't give the same amount anymore. But I like to look at mono ingredient lists as though a Pokemon has helping bonus plus ingredient finding up, just for comparison. So if you would normally accept an ABA with helping bonus and ingredient finding up, then you should equally accept a mono apple with no stats at all. So if it had 1 or 2 good stats, that's already pretty good. The next comparison I want to look at is for Cacao. It's a Cacao problem that we've had since the start of the game. This problem also applies to Egg, Delibird versus Abomasnow. But the good thing about Abomasnow is Abomasnow doesn't have any other role. Tomatoes can be farmed by someone else, so then Abomasnow can just do eggs. They can both do eggs. For Blastoise, however, there's no one else to do the milk role unless you use Sprigatito that has milk at level 30-60, but then you need to use a potato farmer that's level 30-60 on Victory Bell when Sprigatito actually does mono potato better. So you're compromising the entire ingredient build if you try to move the milk problem onto someone else. So my general recommendation is just leave the Cacao problem with Blastoise and try to deal with it without having to move everything else around. Regardless, let's have a look at what the problem is. So Absol is hard to find and expensive to catch, but it is the only true mono Cacao option in the game. Squirtle is a lot easier to find, and BAA is a 2 in 9 chance of rolling compared to AAA. So while Absol is significantly better with farming Cacao than Blastoise is, about 30% better at level 30, when we get to level 60, because BAA is very close to the mono ingredient, Blastoise can sometimes actually beat Absol. So let's set everything to level 60. Now you can see that Absol still farms just a tiny bit more Cacao than Blastoise when Blastoise has the BAA option. But the catch here is my settings are set to not sleep at all. So the productions are collected every time they're produced. Blastoise though has a larger inventory, and with a larger inventory it means that if you don't log into the game often or it's an overnight long sleep, then because of the greater inventory, Blastoise can actually farm more Cacao than Absol if you're not playing the game frequently. So let's go into my settings and change to, let's say, 8 hours of sleep. And now you can see the numbers actually flipped around. Blastoise farming more Cacao than Absol because in 8.5 hours, Absol got capped at 18 inventory, whereas Blastoise has a bit more inventory to work with to earn more ingredients overall. So be very careful how you analyze who's the better farmer when you look at these numbers, because inventory does come into play when you input sleep into the calculator. But then you might ask me, well, people sleep, so shouldn't Blastoise just be generally better? I would argue that, well, actually you shouldn't really be sleeping with Absol anyway. Because of its low inventory, you should just use it as a day farmer and then put it back in the box before you go to sleep. And instead, switch your team out to have berry specialists go to sleep instead. Then we are comparing only daytime farming, where Absol is the king of Cacao. You just have to make sure you don't hit that inventory limit when you're farming with Absol. And if you remember this chart I made a long time ago, that is why I continue to leave inventory as an amazing skill for an ingredient specialist, because I don't expect everyone to be able to collect their productions very often. I expect some people to not be able to collect their stuff for certain periods of time, in which case ingredient specialists can really use that inventory. So yes, indeed, Blastoise can actually be better than Absol for Cacao farming depending on the situation. In fact, some argue that raising 2 Blastoise, one for milk, one for Cacao, is probably more realistic than ever even bothering with hunting Absol or even raising it, because of how hard it is to find and to level up with the lack of candies. Which is also why Cacao Blastoise has always been in the early game alternative and was actually discussed in this kind of depth in the very first video I made about the mono ingredient, because it has two roles to take care of. Now, besides running 2 Blastoise, there are other ways we can try to mitigate this problem. One is if you do happen to get an AAX Absol, just use that at level 30. I mean, I'm assuming that you're not at level 60 yet. Why not just use it as a level 30 cacao farmer? Because we know that at level 30, Absol does more cacao than Blastoise at level 30. So you can have a level 30 Cacao Absol as your cacao supplementary ingredient specialist. Ideally though, I would not have apple as its level 60 ingredient. Maybe I would prefer mushroom instead, because apple just takes up all of the inventory and can't really farm anything else. And besides that, we have better apple options. We have Fuecoco or Pinsir. Whereas mushroom, currently it's still just Gengar, so mushroom makes a little bit more sense. So I would accept a Cacao Absol or a Cacao Mushroom Absol, both of which would be reasonable to use at level 30 in the meantime. Other options include Nightcap Pikachu that can farm cacao, and berry or skill specialists that can farm cacao, so maybe you would put a bit more preference on raising the ones that have cacao. These are Meganium, the Eeveelutions, Dodrio, even Slowbro can do cacao, but of course Slowbro should probably focus on tails instead. And then we've got Dedenne, Golduck, Marowak. These are all possible supplementary cacao farmers besides having Blastoise and Absol doing cacao. My advice is not to make the Blastoise cacao problem a Sprigatito milk problem. Have a mono milk Blastoise and somehow work around with one of these other strategies to farm cacao. And I have to say the cacao problem is actually improving. Because of the Paldean's release, before we did consider Absol as an alternative apple farmer, but that is no longer necessary. We don't need to invest in an ABB Absol or any Absol that has apple at all. We can now just have Absol focus on cacao. Speaking of Sprigatito, let's talk about our next question. Now, no one actually asked me this, but I still want to clarify this because I feel like it should have been a question for my last video. What if I already invested in something that doesn't really fit in with the mono ingredient list? Well, Victory Bell is a really good example now, because before the Paldeans released, this was the best option for potatoes. So a lot of us had already invested in a BAA potato farmer that is Victory Bell. Well, to me, it's actually not essential to get an AAA Sprigatito, even though it is significantly better, and that would be my goal to replace this Victory Bell at some point in the future. But it is not useless. If I do happen to find a perfect mono potato Meowscarada, well, what will happen to my BAA Victory Bell? Well, quite frankly, nothing. I am going to still raise it to level 60. Remember that BAA is the closest thing there is to mono ingredient. It's just a different species, that's all. So it still heavily farms potatoes. The only difference is that level 1, that 2 times tomato is not potato, which is a relatively small number. It's better than this ingredient being something else or this ingredient being something else. I would much rather the level 1 ingredient be something else. And don't forget box healing. So if your Meowscarada has a bad healer day and it's going below 80% or going below 60% even, and it's just not farming what you need, well then you can rotate in your BAA Victory Bell for those potato farming on those days. Don't forget that when you have a lot of Pokemon invested, you don't even need an energy for everyone healer, because 5% healing on an infinite number of boxed Pokemon is an infinite number of heals. So if you can utilize that box healing well, because you've got several duplicate investments, then you can just rotate them in when the energy runs low. Of course, I'm not recommending this when you first start investing in your Pokemon. If you're just starting the game now, go all in for Sprigatito instead of trying to get a Bellsprout to also do potatoes. This is just to say that if you've already invested in something, it's not completely useless. It will get replaced, but at times you can still bring it back out to use. The next question I've had, and this has been asked several times before, is that with mono ingredient, because it doesn't have two different ingredients, it means you have to rotate more. Well, I would actually argue that even if you have mixed ingredient, and again, you have to define what mixed ingredient means. Is it ABA or ABC? If you have mixed ingredient, you actually end up rotating anyway, because after some time, the ratio of the ingredients that you farmed will be wrong, and then you need to bring something else in to supplement the ingredient that you haven't farmed enough, which ends up being a bigger headache than if you were to just use mono ingredient, because you always get the right amount of what you need. But I would argue that if you know when to nap, your nap can coincide with when you actually change out the ingredient specialist, and hopefully it's restored its energy back to 95 or 100%, so there's no issue with energy if you change out your ingredient specialist when you sync your nap. And now for the final thing I want to do in this video is to create the semi-mono ingredient specialist list. What is semi-mono ingredient? Well, if you learned anything from this video, it is that, well, it's easier to hunt if the second ingredient is not the same as the first ingredient. There's a 2 in 9 chance of getting the right ingredient list, like a BAA list. So if I've already invested in some BAA options, or I feel like it's an easier hunt to go for BAA as opposed to AAA for everything, what would this list look like? Well, let's go over to Nerd's ingredient spreadsheet to find out how we can move things around, because this sheet I can actually edit. This here is the mono ingredient list. As you can see, we've got Corn Beware, Ditto and Slowbro for tails, Quacklefor and Ductrio for leeks, Gengar for mushrooms, Blastoise, Absol for cacao. That's the classic mono ingredient spread. Well, what happens if we start moving things around? Let me just say that some things shouldn't move around to start. For example, Gengar, Quacklefor, and Slowbro or Ditto, they are already not part of the 1 in 9 chance to roll, because their second ingredient is different to their first. So that's something we don't need to worry about. We're going to keep those in place. Dragonite should not change roles, because besides Gengar, there is no one else that can do herbs at level 30, so you can't get anyone else for a BAA option for herbs. So Dragonite still has to stay with the herb option. That means Dragonite cannot be a BAA corn farmer, because if it does, then there's no one for herbs. So even in a semi-mono ingredient spread, Dragonite still has to stick with mono herbs. What we can do for potato is still have Victreebel as the BAA potato farmer. So we can remove Meowscarada as a mono ingredient and have it do milk instead. That allows Blastoise to do cacao instead. So things are falling into place. So I've removed them from this picture as we're building towards a semi-mono ingredient build. We can also remove Delibird because it's AAA for eggs, and it's a great news to remove Delibird since it's so hard to farm. So we can use a BAA Abomasnow as our main egg farmer at level 60. And coming back to corn, as I said before, since we can't run BAA Dragonite unless you plan to have 2 Dragonites, one for BAA and one for AAA, then unfortunately Beware and Comface still has to be their main corn farmer. So AAA of these are required no matter whether you go mono or semi-mono. Now if we have Charizard do BAA Ginger, then Tyranitar can do BAA Beans, and Golem can be part of BAA Potatoes, and Quacklefor still belongs to the BAA Leeks. But now we've emptied out sausages, so who will do sausages? The sausage options for level 30 are Skeledirge, Toxicroak, or Beware. Of course, Beware needs to focus on corn. That means Skeledirge actually is the sausage option here. Because unfortunately, you can't get a BAA option for oil. So that means Toxicroak, Cramorant, or maybe even Ditto needs to be the AA option for oil, ideally AAA. So there's no room for moving these two ingredient specialists. So we simply move Skeledirge up to sausage farming and have Pinsir as our main BAA apple farmer. And now we have to find honey farmers for BAA. Unfortunately, there is no such a thing as a BAA honey farming, so either Pinsir or Venusaur has to be the AAA honey farming option. But remember, Pinsir's already assigned the BAA apple role. So that leaves us with Venusaur as the only available option to do honey, and you can't do it as BAA, it will have to be a 1 in 9 chance for the AAA option. So what's interesting now is that we, instead of having a Blastoise Cacao problem, we actually have a Venusaur tomato or honey problem, because the only Pokemon that can do BAA for tomato is Venusaur, who currently is locked into doing honey based on this semi-mono ingredient spread. So we still have a problem. Thankfully, the problem is more easily mitigated because of the abundance of ingredient specialists that can do tomatoes. At some point, you will probably encounter a mono tomato option anyway. Could it be Dugtrio, or Mr. Mime, or Victreebel, or Bomber Snow? All of those are possible choices for finding that 1 in 9 mono tomato option. And so I've just kind of moved everything around to make everything look a bit nicer. So this is what a semi-mono ingredient build looks like. And I just coined this term. No one else is using this term at the moment. It's just what I've come up with to show you guys an alternative to mono ingredient. And this should be a cheaper option because a number of these options are a 2 in 9 chance of rolling as opposed to 1 in 9. But you still end up with some clashes, like Venusaur being both honey or tomato in the semi-mono option, so you have to find a workaround for that. You'll need another Pokemon to cover the tomato option. And some species just can't move out of their role even if you want to do BAA, like Dragonite. Simply, there's not enough redundancy for herbs for it to move out of doing herbs. So mono herb Dragonite is still super important. Just remember that this is a level 60 meta, because at level 30, this list is significantly worse than the actual mono ingredient spread. And I am still a firm advocate for the mono ingredient build because of all the benefits, including level 30, not just level 60. How you mix and match a mono versus a semi-mono, or maybe even some mixed ingredients, you'll have to work that out yourself. And the mono ingredient build allows you to have even less wastage because its level 1 ingredient is the correct ingredient as well. Let me know if you guys have any more questions about this topic in the comment section below. And hopefully this video has clarified some of the concerns that you guys have about the mono ingredient spread. Don't forget that it's actually okay to keep waiting on mono ingredient specialists, because at the end of the day, there are other options to power up Snorlax. Don't forget that at the start of the game, we've always been and still have been using the Berry Specialist meta. Berry Specialist with Berry Finding S, lots of speed, that is still a priority before you hunt ingredient specialists. Because the idea of mono ingredient is to be farming ingredients quick enough so that you can go back to a good berry specialist. If you don't have a good berry specialist, well then the benefits of having a perfect ingredient build are diminished. So make sure you hunt some good berry specialists or generalists. And that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.